For our members and guests located in India, the United States, and elsewhere, we're really pleased to have you here today. This is a USIBC rapid response webinar on the TRAI OTT consultation paper, and we're really pleased to have an industry expert from Nishith Desai Associates present and give us some background and details on what this paper is, its overview, its objective, and where it goes. Following the presentation, we'll have an internal conversation about what and how USIBC might say in response. But before we do that, I always like to acknowledge a few of our USIBC leaders in our digital economy. I see a few of you here. I apologize if I don't reference everyone, but I'd like to thank Jared Doherty, who is our one of our media and entertainment co-chairs based out of Singapore at Warner Brothers Discovery. I want to thank you, Jared, for all your support. We have Amit Kushwala as well from AT&T, who leads in some of our activities around telecommunications issues. And if I've missed anyone else in our leadership team, I do apologize, but thank you all for your consistent and ongoing support. For here and now, I'd like to invite and thank Anirban and Puru from Nishith Desai Associates. Nishith Desai and Associates is one of our knowledge partners. They really help us understand and respond to various media and entertainment issues within the US-India bilateral corridor. And so I really thank you for your time. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Anirban, to pull up some slides to give us some background on this important issue around OTTs. And I'm hoping that you also provide a bit of some context of how this TRAI consultation fits into the larger telecommunication bill and other sorts of regulations around not only telecoms, but ancillary services, often known as over the top. So I'm going to go off screen, but I do ask members, if you have any questions or comments, you can either raise your hand or post them on the chat. We'll capture them and we'll respond to them at the tail end of the presentation. So with that, over to you, Anirban and Puru. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for the introduction, Jay. So hi, everyone. This is Anirudh and Puru from Nishith Desai Associates. I'm just putting on the slides from the beginning. Hope this is visible to everyone.
Perfect.
So yeah, so Puru, why don't you start, please?
Yeah, we can just jump into the first slide. Good evening, everyone. What we are going to do is the consultation paper on regulation of OTT is definitely not new. So what we'll do is we'll dive into some context of what has happened till now. What was the motivation for TRAI to come out with this consultation paper, and what we are looking at when what is the impact of this consultation paper, what could be the overlap with the existing regulations or maybe regulators on the same subject matter. So I hope everyone can hear me clearly, so please let me know somewhere in the middle if it drops off. But diving quickly into how we have come to this stage. Now, OTT regulations are something that the two regulators, right, which is in the telecom industry, which is the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India and the Department of Telecommunications, have looked at in the past and have looked at multiple times actually. And it was maybe the first major move was in 2015, as you can see on the screen, when there was the first consultation paper on regulating OTT services. Now, again, I'll tell you, I'll give you a brief difference of what TRAI sought to consult on in 2015 and what TRAI sought to consult on in 2018. In 2015, it was more of whether there should be a regulatory framework on all over-the-top services. Now, again, it did not define what over-the-top services exactly are, but it did give some categories of what over-the-top services are in 2015. And it divided them into, say, messaging or voice services. It divided them into app ecosystems, such as social media or e-commerce sites. And it also divided it between video and audio content. So in these three categories were generally thought of, and this was way before even this was also before a detailed study was conducted by the International Telecommunications Union on the proliferation of OTT services. The recommendations, or it did not result in any regulatory framework. There was also to note, there was also a DOT report on maintaining net neutrality, where the DOT, the Department of Telecommunications, actually recommended that net neutrality be maintained. And to for the uninitiated, net neutrality is in very simple words, where you don't discriminate as an internet service provider between say the quality of data transmission or the speed of data transmission or any service requirement for different domains or different URLs. So there was a report on net neutrality in 2015, which where again DOT sort of delved into what could be these OTT services, and to what extent have these OTT services been distributed into various categories of different type of services. The main consultation paper actually came in 2018 because of its much narrower focus than the 2015 consultation paper, because the 2018 consultation paper, as opposed to 2015, only focused on OTT communication services, which is that not all services over the top or on the internet that is available, but only those which are used for communication, because the authority also recognized that there are these services which seemingly are replacing telecom services such as voice and data. I mean, all the obvious examples come to mind. There is Skype, which is for video calling, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, like we're doing now. So different types of communication services which are making customers gravitate from, say, using SMS previously, which is a telecom service, or using PSTN services, which is calling voice call services on telecom networks. They've kind of shifted to these apps. So that was one. That was the need, and the issue that was consultant was whether these OTT services, because they're kind of providing the same service, should be in a equal licensing framework, or it should be in a similar licensing framework, put on the same pedestal as telecom service providers. I'll tell you why. Because telecom service providers under the current Indian telecommunication regime are operating under a license from the government of India, wherein this license provides various conditions on how a TSP should operate. And that includes service quality requirements, that includes, say, government access to these, or government interception or government blocking to the data transmission that is happening, the security of the network that should be maintained, the license, and very importantly, license fees that should be paid to the government, including maintaining bank guarantees at that time. So all of these monetary and operational considerations, including these were not conditions that were imposed on OTT service providers, but were imposed on, but are imposed on telecom service providers, which is why the need came to even assess if there was a need to put OTT services in the same bracket, and which is largely the theme of the consultation paper that we have right now. This came, the 2018 consultation paper resulted in recommendations from TRAI. You can see the points listed on the screen, but the quick takeaway from it is that TRAI decided not to go ahead and recommend any regulatory framework as of then, because one, it understood that the industry was still developing, and it was kind of waiting for a more global consensus, say from example, the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union. This consultation paper is a result of a reference from the Department of Telecommunications in 2022, referring back to these 2020 recommendations. And now, because it highlighted some needs of why this consultation paper has to come, which is in the next slide. There are two needs that the Department of Telecommunications has highlighted and directed TRAI to consider if there should be a regulatory mechanism. First is the growth of OTT services in the recent past. We have, of course, keep in mind that OTT services itself, which includes a larger gambit of services other than communication services. We have seen intermediary guidelines under the Information Technology Act also come out, which kind of regulates OTT content services and news content services. So we have seen some kind of regulatory movement there. But one of the main motivations was the general growth of these OTT services, and that these services, having reached a mature stage. So that was a motivation of one of the core issues. The other motivation was for the other core issue of this consultation paper, which is on selective banning, which I think Aniruddha will be able to provide better context here.
Sure. Thanks for that, Puru. So while there's that entire discussion about how OTT should be regulated vis-a-vis telecom services, because as Puru mentioned, what OTT services do is sometimes act as substitutes for telecom services, is what it's being argued. So on those same lines, when let's say there are internet shutdowns in India, and that in the recent past there have been quite a few instances where the government has taken a call to block the entire internet in a certain area. Let's say where there's a public order situation, there's any civil unrest, and so on and so forth, or even if there's anticipated public order situations, right? So in those situations, what again the discussion has been is, since people can even communicate through OTT services, OTT communication services, and an internet shutdown has far wider consequences than, let's say, barring certain platforms. So what regulators really want to look at is how would selective banning of OTT services work out, right? Because let's say if there's the internet can actually even if you shut down the internet, it can even affect banking operations, medical facilities, stock exchanges, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, if only certain OTT services are banned, what is being contemplated is that the key communication channels could be prohibited. And this is something even the parliamentary committee was discussing, right? Trying to see what kind of measures can be taken with respect to selective banning, whether it's even feasible, whether it's technically possible, whether it will actually achieve the objectives, and so on. But we'll delve into the details of that in a bit. I'll just hand it back to Puru to continue on the details of the regulations and the as in the proposed regulations.
Yeah, thanks, Anirudh. We can move to the next slide. So now there are three large parts of this consultation paper that three large themes that it covers. First, second, and third part are the most core issues of which questions arise. But of course, first kind of sets the context. The first part is what are OTT services, and if we can come up with a definition. And the second part is what is OTT communication services and whether we need to regulate them specifically. And the third is whether there should be selective banning of OTT services. So coming to the first part on OTT services itself, now TRAI has not given a conclusive definition of what OTT services are. It has referred to other bodies that have attempted to define. The body of European regulators for electronic communications report was from 2016, which gave a definition of OTT services like you see on the screen. The ITU, the Commonwealth Telecom and Communication Organization, have come up with definitions. But the important point to note here is out of all these definitions, the common element is only that these services are provided through content or through apps over the public internet. And mind you, public internet is already a regulated activity, or sorry, providing the public internet as a service is a regulated activity which ISPs do under the grant of a license in India. Over and above this public internet, what apps you provide or what content you provide, all of these might come under the larger ambit of OTT services. So the next, we can move to the next slide. There are certain issues highlighted by TRAI on why we need to look at the second part, which is the regulation of OTT communication services. The first was only for a definition of what the general gamut of OTT services are. But second is specifically with regard to OTT communication services, what is the need? Like why should we look at a separate regulatory framework? And there are a lot of overlap with issues that arose in the Indian Telecommunication Bill of 2022. We'll also come to that towards the end. So the three main reasons is, one is of course the proliferation of OTT services, and like I said, people migrating to voice call and a video call and text messaging services away from services that your Airtel or Vodafone or any other TSP provides, to OTT services like WhatsApp, Facebook, all of that. So the second is the consequential. The consequence of this is, while TSPs are governed by licensing conditions, which I spoke about briefly in the first few minutes, the OTT service providers are more of tech service providers on the internet and are not governed by the same licensing conditions, while giving sort of a similar service to customers. So whether they should be brought under an equal licensing framework. The third main motivation, or the third main need for seeing if there should be regulation of OTT services, there are other sort of compliances that are required in response to government requests for, say, interception, for blocking of content, privacy and cybersecurity, and liability of intermediaries for any, say, illegal content that is transmitted across the platform. Again, quickly, this is something that we've already covered, that there are licensing conditions that are applicable on telecom service providers under the Indian Telegraph Act, but not on OTT communication services. The only say, major similar legislation that applies for both OTT and licensed telecom services are the last row that you see, which is under the Information Technology Act. Yeah, I'll let Anirudh take the issue on selective banning. I think we can go to the next slide directly to selective banning, because these are questions that are posed that we already discussed. So yeah, we can take it from here. Yes.
Sure. Thanks for that, Guru. So as you were talking about selective banning earlier, right? So I'll just give some context on what exactly is the primary reason behind selective banning, which is basically concerns regarding both public order situations, whether anticipated or currently ongoing. It can also be a curbing of misinformation, especially by actors such as terrorists. But why exactly is selective banning a primary issue? Is that, as I said, a complete shutdown of telecom services affects people in far too many ways, including financial services, health services, education even. And even the parliamentary committee had recognized that there are issues with technical feasibility of selective banning, because a lot of services might be hosted on a cloud and they might be difficult to ban selectively, since they can operate from different locations. They could even operate out of locations outside India and still be accessible to people in India. But what they noted was that certain websites which operate through fixed URLs, such as WhatsApp, Facebook, Telegram, which were some of the examples even the parliamentary committee cited, these they suggested can be blocked because they are through fixed URL. So that's how the parliamentary committee was looking at it. This is something even TRAI has cited in its report. Of course, they haven't reached any conclusion on that. All they are saying is that this is what has been said earlier, and now the consultation process is to understand what the relevant stakeholders think about this. So as far as blocking of telecom resources is concerned, we already have the Telegraph Act from 1885. It's a very old legislation which still holds during current times, even with all the developments in telecommunication technology. Now, what it says is that in case of a public emergency or in the interest of public safety, either the central government or a state government can direct that a message or class of messages to or from any person or class of persons or relating to any particular subject brought for transmission by or transmitted or received by any telegraph shall not be transmitted. So this is in effect what the provision says is that uh, any telegraph can be it's broadly defined to include any sort of telecommunication device. Now this provision is what really grants the government the power to at least this provision is what the government uses to shut down internet or ban telecom services in certain areas. This is coupled with rules which came out in 2017, which lay down the guidelines through which such blocking orders can be made. These are the temporary suspension of telecom services rules from 2017. Now, again, this has certain safeguards because these directions can only be made by certain officials of the central government or state government. Such orders need to be reviewed by a review committee, and so on and so forth. Interestingly, this was even challenged before the Supreme Court, where there were guidelines laid down for what exactly these orders can contain. So we'll go to that in a bit. But before going there, we can also look at what exactly does the IT Act have, right? So the Information Technology Act, which is a much more recent legislation from 2000 than the 1885 legislation. Now, this provides the government with specific powers to block access to certain information available on the internet. And the grounds under which the blocking order can be made are also similar to what's there under the Telegraph Act. So this is interest of sovereignty, integrity of India, defense, security, friendly relations with foreign states, public order, or preventing incitement for the commission of any cognizable offense relating to these grounds. Right. So this section 69A is used very frequently by the government to block access to, let's say, terrorist content or hate speech and so on. But the interesting piece here is that this is used for blocking certain information. It's not used for blocking entire telegraphy services or telecommunication services. Even the rules under the IT Act have certain safeguards and procedures on how content can be blocked. And interestingly, because OTT communication services such as Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, Telegram, and others, they would likely be as in they are considered as intermediaries under Indian law. So for the IT Act, and if they fail to block this information, right, which has been ordered under Section 69A, they can actually be liable for penalties. And this would also apply to telecom service providers because even they are intermediaries. So as far as the issues which are there for selective banning are concerned, there are quite a few issues. I'll just go through them very briefly. Just 1 second. But actually, sorry, before going into the consultation issues, just one thing I wanted to flag was the Supreme Court order in Anuradha Bhasin versus Union of India, which is a 2020 order. That laid down certain guidelines which need to be followed with respect to banning of telecom services or basically internet shutdowns. So one was that all these orders need to be published. These orders will be subject to judicial review. These orders need to be proportional and should not extend beyond the necessary duration. And lastly, while there are no guidelines on how frequently the review committee needs to review these orders, the Supreme Court said that in the absence of guidelines, this review needs to be done every week. So, of course, we are currently looking at how selective banning, whether or not even selective banning will be effective, or whether it's even a solution to the problem. But the Supreme Court orders or these guidelines will be key in figuring out the form of selective banning, if at all it is implemented, right? So as far as the issues for consultation are concerned, I'll not read through the entire list, but from a very broad perspective, what are the technical challenges in selective banning of OTT? Second is whether there is even a need to put in place a regulatory framework for selective banning. Then third, in case it is decided to put in place a regulatory framework, then which classes of OTT services should be covered? So for example, OTT services, as Puru was mentioning, have been categorized into various types, right? So one could be social media intermediaries, one could be communication intermediaries, even online streaming services are considered as OTT services. So out of these, which are the ones which need to be regulated, if at all? And they've also asked what should be the provisions and mechanisms for such a regulatory framework. So it's a broad consultation. It is not just limited to, uh, you know, looking at reasons, but they are even asking for suggestions on mechanisms for the actual regulation. Next, of course, is there also a need to selectively ban specific websites apart from OTT services? So are there some websites which could actually, you know, propagate the problem, although they may not be considered as OTT services? And apart from this, any other relevant issues or suggestions related to regulatory mechanisms? So that's largely the list of issues for consultation. Uh, I'm mindful of the time. I think we just have 1 minute on the clock. Puru, do you have anything else to add here?
I just want to touch upon the telecom bill. Now, some of you might remember in the Indian Telecommunication Bill of 2022, the draft actually suggested that the definition of telecommunication services should include OTT communication services. Now, what are OTT communication services? In the bill itself did not find a second definition. But it did have a lot of pushback and criticism from the industry that, like you can see on the screen, again, because of the stringent license conditions, financial requirements that these OTT service providers can be brought into at par with telecom service providers, while these OTT service providers are, do not even have that infrastructure to begin with. Of course, there's also the Digital India Act, which talks about the recognition of different types of intermediaries, but that is a little bit more down the line. But there is an overlap because of, and the issue is similar to how it was in the telecommunications bill. There is also a potential overlap of regulators because OTT communication services who are intermediaries can anyway, be subject to, say, blocking orders from MITI, for example. Now, how will the interplay between MITI as a regulator and if it is brought under regulation of the DOT, then how will the MITI's say notifications or blocking orders interplay with DOT's license conditions on these OTT service providers? So these are some of the other questions that may come up and be brought up actually in the comments to this consultation paper. We can also take questions.
Great. Thank you, Puru, and thank you, Anuradha, for this great presentation. I want to be mindful of the time as well. I know that you have other meetings to go to. Is it okay if we can take a few questions before you jump off?
Yeah, we can extend by 2, 3, 5 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I do have a couple of questions to ask, but I'd like to open the floor to our members to see if there are any questions for Aniruddha and Puru. Please feel free to raise your hands or drop in your question in the chat window. Okay, maybe I can just start off. So how does this sort of compare with, selectively banning of OTTs in other countries? Is it something that's been looked at in different countries? How does this compare with, or these recommendations or suggestions compare with regulations outside India?
Right. So there's actually an entire section on comparative jurisprudence in other countries. What they have noted is that in most countries, there are no wide internet shutdowns, right? So while OTT services are regulated in some countries to some extent, the issue of selective banning is not, as in there's no consensus on how selective banning should take place, if at all. But a lot of jurisdictions do have blocking powers for specific content, especially, let's say, things like child pornography or extremist content and things like that. But there's really no consensus on how selective banning would take place, if at all.
Thank you. Jay, you have a question?
Sure, thank you, guys. I know I guess earlier in the year, there was some discussions in India about licensing VPNs, and we all know that the use of VPNs allows a certain measure of privacy and for the user to bypass, any particular jurisdiction. How does that fit into all of this? You're on mute.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah. So the issue of these technical challenges, right? Like VPN, of course, is one of the technical challenges that is thrown up. There are some technical issues that are brought up in the consultation paper. For example, if you're if you're shutting down the whole internet, sorry, if you don't opt to shut down the whole internet, you can shut down, say, specific websites or or specific domains, which again, if it is VPNs, then there will be masking of service providers. But really, because these are so dynamic now, a VPN service provider also, if you're using like a Singapore VPN, tomorrow you can be using a VPN from Georgia. So the consultation paper does actually take note of these different technical challenges. What it suggests, at least as a measure to begin with, is where OTT services which operate from a fixed domain or a fixed URL, say for example, facebook.com or whatsapp.com, or any other social media, right? If tiktok.com. So there are specific, if OTT service providers are operating from, say, fixed specific addresses, then it's much easier to block it. So maybe that is an initial measure that can be looked at. And this does not come only from the TRAI consultation paper. This was something that was brought up by the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Communications and Information Technology of the Parliament of India. It was headed by Shashi Tharoor, and it gave its report in 2021, which actually where actually this whole selective banning issue started from. And there also they did recognize these technical challenges, but of course, I think it's more to the industry to provide answers.
Great, thank you. Two quick follow-ups, or maybe not so quick. One, how might the proposed rules, or at least how does the paper treat blended OTT applications? Increasingly, you might have an OTT that has a dominant service, then has access to start a text communication, has additional access for video and whatnot. I just think of gaming, for example, where the primary OTT might be a game, but very quickly, you're also texting and have video contact with others. That's one question, and then I'll take that one and have one final question for you.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So I'll just read out what the major features of these communication services are as recognized by TRAI that will help me in answering this question. One is if it is accessed and delivered through the app. And second is more important, which is the element that this communication service has to have direct technical or functional substitute for traditional telecom services. So it's to this extent only that TRAI covers this issue. It does not really cover what happens if there are hybrid different types of OTT services on one app. Maybe how we are looking at the rules is if to the extent that it provides these services which act as a substitute or a functional substitute to traditional telecom services, to that extent it might seek to regulate. Similar to how in the intermediary rules issued by MITI, to the extent that, say, an app provides OCC and news content services, to that extent, intermediary rules part 3 could be applicable to that. So maybe we can draw a very broad, crude similarity to that.
Great. One final question. I know that the definition referenced the public internet or public communications. How does that definition impact enterprise networks that may be primarily internal? It may use a combination of private networks, but also have access to the public network in some instances.
So TRAI has been very clear that, and even in its 2015 consultation paper on OTT services and 2018 consultation paper on OTT communication services, and this one, that this would only include any apps or any content over the public internet. So to the extent, say, a public internet interacts with a private network, I don't think it is looking at regulating that. It should only be limited to any service that is provided over the public internet. There are separate conditions. There are separate services for these private. There are separate service. There are separate conditions for the providing these private network services. I think that is sufficient the way TRAI looks at it. So this is only limited to the public internet.
Thank you. Thanks, Puru, and thanks, Aniruddha, for this presentation. So for everyone on the call, we'll make the presentation available to everyone. And this session is also recorded, so we'll put it up on our YouTube channel as well. So thank you all for joining us. I think we'll stop the recording now.